everyone. And may I invite you to go so our speaker will be easier to speak to you. Try to have a circle. Feel the bond of love. Bond of love. Yes. Let's show some bond of love. Okay. Thank you. And it's so happy to see many new faces and many new sisters in Christ, and a lot of friends that we haven't been seeing in a little while. Welcome tonight. And praise the Lord that Adrian and Paul back in Bay Area again. I think they first came was last April. They came through Ganjie, Sister Josephine, because Sister Josephine joined a fellowship, La Prairie.
Well, yeah, she came to our home. Actually, we were having a New Year's party, a Chinese New Year's party, and she came that night just with a friend, and we met and fell in love with one another. And
that's exactly the same word Ganjie used. When she got back and she called me and she said she had met a wonderful couple who are Jewish Christians and happened to serve the Chinese students and scholars for over 20 years. So it really struck me at that moment. And then we have the privilege to invite them to come to visit the CF in the Bay Area last year. And they first came in April, just before the Resurrection Sunday. I think you talk about, do you believe in the resurrection of Christ? And then it was so well loved by all the fellowships, and we want them to come back last July, the July 4th long weekend, had a workshop for the co-workers of the CF for how to, that was called specialty, how to dig deep into God's Word. And had a wonderful workshop last July. And this year, again, gonna let their steps back, their hearts as well, back to our group and back to the Bay Area, back to be with the CFs, and they had a chance to visiting the different groups at Stanford, Berkeley, UCSF, and then they met another couple, missionaries at Berkeley, and they felt God's calling them for something higher. And also they reach out to Monterey. We just had a talk before the fellowship tonight. I see how God's hand is making all these things coming together. God said everything become beautiful in His time, and I trust God has purpose for all this happening. And otherwise, we would not have even dreamed of Jewish Christian and serving Chinese. And I think it doesn't happen without purpose. So, and tonight, last year we introduced a little bit of your backgrounds, but tonight I think we have a lot of new friends. And just for those who are new about them, they came to the Bay Area in the 70s, right?
Mm-hmm.
Early 70s, and Paul was teaching, and Adrian is also teaching, maybe at the time, in the colleges, in philosophy and sociology, psychology.
New York.
And New York. Their story of how they came to Christ was just amazing. Last time, Adrian shared a little bit, but didn't have enough time for her to elaborate on that. Hopefully one day, one time, we'll have that. It's amazing. And to cut the story, I sent the introduction in the email, so I think to save time, I'm going to omit the major part. But one part I want to really point it out. This year marked their 41 year of being saved. And they're back to the area. And they're praying for God's leading and God's will in their life, and in their serving, in their mission. So tonight we have the privilege of having Paul to speak on one of the most fascinating, most important biblical character, David. How David such a flawed man has so many sins. It's a man after God's heart. Will have God, please. Thank you.
These are not easy seats to
Would you like to, do you need to move that after the session?
No, I don't think so. I'm glad you're close. I am trying to get over an unending cold. So, we try not to.
Some other friends would like to join.
We try not to come here too often, because if we did, eventually you get to see all of our faults and failings. But, which makes me think, actually that's a good connection and a lead into talking about David in the Bible. I don't know how familiar with the Old Testament, or the New Testament for that matter, any of you are. But David was a man of very large faults, failings. When you read through, and there's much said about it in the Bible, he's also described as a man after God's own heart. And you read about all the failings and some very serious sin in David's life. But God never took back what he said about David. Despite the faults and despite the failings, there's something about this man that God himself said, can you imagine having that said about you? This was a man or a woman whose heart resonated, vibrated with, was in agreement with my heart. That is an amazing statement. And Jesus himself will be known for all eternity as the Son of God. He's also identified as the son of David, king of Israel. Quite remarkable. Let me put something in parentheses here. My parentheses often turn into they run for pages and pages. I'll try not to do that too long, but just in talking about David, I recall often how there are many things in the Bible that I don't know what you expect when you open up this book, but my expectation was it's going to be, all the characters are going to be close to, if not perfect. And you start to read the Bible, not just the Old Testament, but especially the Old Testament. And especially in the life of David, you discover things that, honestly, it was almost embarrassing. And I would think to myself, I said, God, if God had asked me, if God had given me the unpublished manuscript of the Bible and asked me to read it and to edit it for him, make recommendations, there are many parts that I would have said, you know what, leave this out. You know, I mean, just kind of leave this out. This really, you want to win friends and influence people, don't tell them this. And I imagine God saying, leave it in. Leave it in. no airbrushing, no editing. This is reality. These are people who are real people. And this is what I am like. This is going to cause, some things are confusing, some things are difficult to understand. So, leave it in. And in the beginning, before I believed, those were the things, and I won't give you a whole long list. You'll find them for yourself if you read honestly, as you would read anybody. Those are the things that were my reasons for not being a Christian and not believing in them. And as the years have gone by, those very things have become my reasons for believing and for trusting this book. And I've gotten to the place of saying, God, thank you. Thank you for leaving it in. Thank you for not airbrushing all the scars and the warts and the pimples and the... Thank you. Because now I can trust you. I can trust your book because you're being real and you're being honest. And you're taking the risk of confusing and offending me and trusting that there's enough that's going to come through that reality that will win my heart to you and to your people. Which is why I love David so much, because he is an example of just that. God said, leave it in. And we can't go back to, was that Saturday recorded?
I think it was.
We did a whole day.
Oh, maybe
talking
not.
about the life. Well, maybe not. I was going to say, for only $19.95, you can get it. I can't repeat all of that, but that's kind of a broad introduction. Just get a sense of, this is a very real, a man of, he's human, like we are. And yet, I can't repeat, I could, but then you'd be here all night. I won't repeat everything from a whole day on Saturday. But if I had to pick one thing that kind of defines what it means to be a man after the heart of God, a real man who in his real life was a picture of, a portrait of something that goes right to the heart of the God of the Bible and reveals God. A man revealing God, a flawed, imperfect human being who in his life still reveals an infinite and perfect God, which is quite amazing. So, there's an incident in the Bible, and it's in 2 Samuel in the Old Testament. If you're not familiar with the books and you want to follow somebody around, will point you back. It's 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel. There's an incident, a relationship between David and a man named Mephibosheth. I'm going to test you. You all have to say Mephibosheth. How would you like to be named Mephibosheth? But there's no way to understand this incident without some background. There's a prequel to the story that we have to look at. There's something that happened probably before Mephibosheth was born. When he wasn't alive, when there was no Mephibosheth, there's something that took place in David's life that was crucial that really determined his relationship to this man who at the time did not exist. But you cannot understand what happened between David and Mephibosheth. See, even I can. You know who I am.
Mephibosheth.
What's the Chinese name?
Should we write it on the board?
What's the Chinese?
So which chapter?
We'll get back to it.
It's chapter 9 of 2 Samuel.
Chapter 9, okay.
No. But first, you have to go back to 1 Samuel, chapter 18. Beginning of chapter 18, 1 Samuel. And here's the setting. Israel, the people of Israel, have chosen a king for themselves. That's King Saul. Saul is described as being very handsome and taller, from his shoulders up, taller than everyone in Israel. And all the people were quite taken with Saul. He's the first king in Israel, but he is not God's choice of king. David is God's choice. And through interesting circumstances, David finds himself brought into the palace by Saul. Saul he recognizes something in David, he has a love for David, but David wins the heart of the people, and he becomes more popular than Saul. And Saul's heart is revealed. Saul becomes intensely jealous and angry, and ultimately wants to kill David, to eliminate David. He fears David and his popularity, and senses that God is going to replace Saul, with David. Saul has a son named Jonathan. Now, when a king dies, who becomes king after him? He has a son. Jonathan is the prince. Jonathan knows that he is the heir to the throne. When his father dies, he becomes king of all Israel. And here's David living in the palace, Saul becoming jealous of David, fearful of David, and yet, well, here's the beginning. Let me read the first 4 verses of chapter 18, 1 Samuel. David has been speaking with Saul, and it says, as soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David. And I haven't done any knitting ever. Real men knit. I mean, I don't have any problem with knitting. Any knitters? You know what knitting is? You ever see anybody? You get, was it 2 or more threads and these needles, and what you're doing is tying little knots, tying different pieces of yarn and just tying hundreds of thousands of little knots until those 2 separate strands become one piece of material where you can't separate them anymore. That's the picture. Jonathan recognizes something in David. He knows he recognizes the soul of this man. And this is the birth of, this is really the definition of true friendship. It's a very precious word. Don't use it loosely. Don't use any word loosely. These men are bound together. They know each other. Their lives are now entangled, inseparable. Now remember who Jonathan is. He's the heir to the throne. His soul was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let him, David, return to his father's house. He kept him in the palace. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own son. Covenant? Legally, that doesn't do justice. A contract. It's a deep, unbreakable promise and bond. A contract of heart to heart. And we'll see what that covenant was, the content of it. But love leads to covenant and promise. When your souls are knit together, this is what comes out. He made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword, and his bow, and his belt. You have to picture this. His robe, probably purple, the royal color, the representation, the symbol, the symbol of who he was and his position. And he takes it off, lays down his armor, gives to David. Who is David? He's the youngest son of someone, Jesse the Bethlehemite. David was a shepherd. Mm-hmm. And if you've been a shepherd for long enough, even as weeks and months go by, you still smell like sheep. If you're with sheep long enough, it gets into your hair, your clothes, your skin. He is a shepherd, living in the palace with the son of the king. And yet, Jonathan takes off his robe. This is an acknowledgement. I know who you are. And I know that you will be king. You will occupy the place that would have been mine. And yet, he acknowledges that that is the case and gives the robe to David, puts down all his defense, his shield, everything defense, all his defenses drop. You can't let someone else into your heart and have your souls knit together while you still keep your defenses up. Jonathan let down his defenses. He dared and had the fearful courage to trust this man. Open his soul to someone else. His father, the source of half the genes in his body that were working inside of him, determining every thought and action and movement of his body and his brain, came from Saul, who feared David, was jealous of David, and his biological son opened his soul to this shepherd and let him in, and they were knit together. And they formed a bond and a covenant together. That's the essence of the background that we need. I don't want to rush through this. That's chapter 18. Chapter 19. Again, the beginning of the chapter. Saul is being driven mad by his fear and his jealousy of David. That's what jealousy will do in the human heart if unchecked and not removed. It will drive you mad, and you will find yourself doing things that you never imagined were possible. That was the condition of Saul. Saul he's thrown spears at David. Beginning of chapter 19. Saul spoke to Jonathan his son and to all his servants that they should kill David. This is the father telling his son, along with his servants, I want David dead. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted much in David. You're going to feel the conflict. His father has said, I want you to kill him. I want him, and it's for your own interest. He is a threat to your future, and you're ascending to the throne. But Jonathan delighted much in David. And Jonathan told David, Saul, my father, seeks to kill you. Therefore, be on your guard in the morning. Stay in a secret place and hide yourself, and I will go and stand behind my... Well, he goes on and says he's going to warn David. Let me skip down. He argues on behalf of David with his father. He says in verse 5, for he, David, took his life in his hand, and he struck down the Philistine. And the Lord worked a great salvation for all Israel. You saw it and rejoiced. Why then will you sin against innocent blood by killing David without cause? And Saul listened to the voice of Jonathan, and swore, as the Lord lives, he shall not be put to death. And Jonathan told all this to David. Saul is a very interesting character. Invite us back next January when it's 25 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit in St. Paul. And we'll go through so the whole day, just examine Saul's character. Very interesting. But don't wait for spring next time. 1 Samuel, now skip ahead to chapter 20. Saul seems to change his mind. He listens to Jonathan, but not for long. He bends, but you know, if you bend a tree, if the wind is strong enough, the tree will bend over. But as soon as the wind stops, what happens? Because his heart was not changed. The fear and the jealousy were more powerful. But here's Jonathan preserving the life of David, risking his own life to disagree with and argue with his father to save David. But Saul hardens his heart. He wants to destroy David. He reaches a point where nothing, not even the words of his son, can change his mind. And he is intent on hunting down David like a wild animal to kill him. So, verse 20. Chapter 20, yes. From, where is this? Chapter 20, verse 12. David is hiding, knowing that Saul is hunting him. Jonathan comes to him. And Jonathan said to David, the Lord, the God of Israel, be witness. When I have sounded out my father about this time tomorrow, or the third day, behold, if he is well disposed toward David, shall I not send and disclose it to you? But, verse 13, should it please my father to do you harm, the Lord do so to Jonathan and more also, if I do not disclose it to you and send you away, that you may go in safety. If Saul is determined to kill you, I will come and warn you and save you so that you can escape. And then he goes on and says, may the Lord be with you, David, as he has been with my father. Verse 14. If I am still alive, he knows that the Lord is going to find in some way Saul's going to be overthrown. And Jonathan is I love this man. He's saving David. His heart is knit to David. But he stays with Saul. He stands with his father. Ultimately, he will die in battle with his father. If I am still alive, show me the steadfast love of the Lord, that I may not die. And do not cut off your steadfast love from my house, from my family, from my children for generations. Do not cut off your love from my house forever, when the Lord cuts off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth. And Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, may the Lord take vengeance on David's enemies. And Jonathan made David swear again by his love for him, for he loved him as he loved his own son. Now that's the end of the introduction. Jonathan is saying, I know the time is going to come when you will become king. The house of my father will be thrown down, and you will replace Saul. And then your sons will be heirs to the throne, and I will not be. When that happens, I want you to swear something. I make a covenant with me, a promise, that you will not completely destroy my father's house, family. What does he say? If I have any children, promise me that you will preserve my name, and that a son of mine will continue to live and bear my name. You have to understand the historical context of what's happening. When you read through the Old Testament, what you see is what has been true in tribes and nations historically for thousands of years. So let me ask you, when there's a revolution, the king is overthrown, the king is killed, and someone else comes and becomes king. What is the first thing that the new king does? Okay, everybody here? You agree? There are ample historical examples. The first thing you do when you have overthrown the old king is you look for how many sons does he have? Where are they? I want them dead. Because what will be the intention of their heart? You've overthrown my father. I would have been king except for you. I was heir to the throne. And what those sons will do is plot and plan and do whatever they can to take back the throne and kill the new king. And the new king knows this. So to solidify his kingdom, the first thing he does is find the children of the old king, those who are closest to him, those who are loyal to him, and throw them in prison, preferably kill them. It doesn't have to be royalty. This is the way of every revolution. To preserve the revolution, you wipe out all the old enemies. Jonathan knows this. And he appeals to David and says, preserve my family and my name. I want you to swear to me, to promise to me, make a covenant that you will be faithful to do this. And David does so. And they enter into this sacred bond and covenant. Eventually, Jonathan dies. He dies in battle. The people of Israel gather around David, and David becomes king in Israel. It takes years. There are enemies, foreign nations, wars are fought, and finally David is now king in all of Israel. Israel is at peace, and his power is now secure. That's the big end of prequel. That's what has happened. David is now established as king of Israel. Now, turn ahead to 2 Samuel, chapter 4. Second Samuel chapter 4 from verse 4. We have David is on the throne. Verse 4, 2 Samuel chapter 4. Jonathan, the son of Saul, had a son who was crippled in his feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel, the news of their death. And his nurse took him up and fled, and as she fled in her haste, he fell and became lame. And his name was Mephibosheth. Why, as soon as the news came, Saul and Jonathan were dead, why did his nurse, his guardian, pick him up and flee? What do you think? She's a faithful servant of Saul and Jonathan, and she knows that Mephibosheth is David's first target. Who is the heir to the throne? His grandfather Saul is dead. His father Jonathan is dead. Who is Mephibosheth? Who would be king in Israel but for David? It's Mephibosheth. He's 5 years old, and his nurse picks him up and flees with him into hiding. They're heading for the countryside. They're heading for the smallest, most obscure, hard-to-reach village way up. It's right on the border of Mongolia. All the way up, if you put it in the context of China. They're heading way out in the countryside where no one can find him in order to save his life. And she falls, and he breaks both ankles. There's no time to head for the local hospital. They can't rush to urgent care and have the bones set. There is no local hospital. And if there was one, there would be a record of him having been there, and David's army would find out, and they'd be able to find him. So she flees. The 5-year-old's bones set, but they've never been put back in the position they should be, and so he is now lame in both feet. years are going by. They're living out in the wilderness. What is going on in Mephibosheth? He hears the story. He was 5 years old. He had enough awareness of who his father was and what was happening. He knows that he should have been living in the palace in Jerusalem with servants all around him. But he's not. Why? It's because of David. That's why. He's limping on both feet. His life has been crippled through no fault of his own. Did I choose this? Did I look for this? Did I want to flee and be hidden in some remote village in the backwaters somewhere out by Outer Mongolia, living when I should be in the palace in, what would it be? That would be Xi'an? Am I getting it? Well, the first capital.
Oh.
Right? The emperor's a little bit. Yeah. Don't be too impressed. But you need to get this picture of I am out here in nowhere, living in hiding, living in fear, crippled, not only in body, crippled emotionally and in soul by bitterness and anger and resentment. My life is the product of forces outside of myself over which I had no control, and I am suffering through no fault of my own, and David is the one behind it all. If not for him, none of this would have been true of me. Can any of you, like myself, identify at all with Mephibosheth? What did you ask? Did you ask for the family that you had? Did you ask for the genes in your body? Did you ask to be shorter than you'd like to be, taller than you'd like to be, fatter than you'd like to be, skinnier than you'd like to be, through no fault of your own? Did you ask for a father who was drunk and watched beating your mother and not being home and not growing up in a family full of the nurture and the love that every child should have? You didn't ask for that. And the result was something crippling and damaging coming into your life because of, in this case, not David, but even if you didn't believe in God, if there is a God, he knew and did nothing to prevent the crippling and the breaking and the wounding and the impairment of your body and your mind and your soul. Some of us emerge from childhood and that blessed, wonderful, happy, secure period of life called adolescence, relatively unscarred and unbroken. I don't understand what it's like to be totally unscarred and unmarred and uncrippled in any way. I can't imagine what that must be like. To some degree, we bear the brokenness and the crippling and the scars that were never chosen, that were the result of circumstances that we had no control over. And whatever you believed or didn't believe, if there was someone who did have some control over those circumstances, Why didn't he, she, it, whatever, do something? What grows up in your heart as those years go by out in nowhere, out in the little village, knowing what it should have been like, but isn't? And those for whom the circumstances were different, and there was more wealth and more opportunity and more circumstances, and they grew up here, and this person who, through no fault or choice of his own, had the advantages, and you didn't, what almost irresistibly, inevitably grows up and forms in your heart? Maybe jealousy, resentment, hatred, depression, resignation. And there's nothing you can do about it. Not only did the God of Israel not protect me and spare me this condition and this life, but now this David, who is the source of all my grief and all of my crippling, is certainly hunting for me like a wild animal. And David knows all about it because I heard the stories. I know what's at work in David. Because it was my grandfather Saul who was hunting him and seeking to kill him. And David was living in caves and constantly hiding and constantly in danger. So David knows that experience, and it was my grandfather who put him through it. So of course he's human. He is wanting to wreak in my life what my grandfather brought into his life. He wants vengeance. He wants some payback for the suffering that he endured, because that's the way it is. You become the new king, you seek to destroy the children of the old king. That's human nature. That must be what is going on in David. And all I can do and all I can hope for is that he not find me and not put me in. That is what has shaped the life of Mephibosheth for we don't know how many years. But it wasn't a week or two. And time has worked its way into this life, the logic of life as we know it. And people will talk and say nice things, but underneath, these are the deep, dark human emotions. Oh, David, he sounds like such, everybody loves him, he's so wonderful. They don't know him the way I know him. 2 Samuel, chapter 9. David is secure on the throne. And one day, this chapter 9 just begins this way. And David said, "Is there still anyone left of the house of Saul?" That's interesting, David. Why do you ask? If you were there in the palace, there was a gathering, all of the king's advisors, and one day David says, I was just wondering. Just wondering, the thought occurred to me, and I wonder, is there anyone left from the house of Saul? King David, Why do you ask? Why do you ask? Okay. Is there anyone left of the house of Saul that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? What's your reaction? What are you thinking? You're there listening to. Oh, you want to know if there's anyone left so that you may show him kindness. Kindness for Jonathan's sake. If you've lived in the real world, you listen to this, and what are you thinking? Yeah, sure, right. Yeah, kindness. You want to show him kindness after all these years. I don't think so. But I'm not going to contradict you. Oh, for Jonathan's sake, his dead father, who would have been king in your place, anyway. Right, like your relationship and your friendship with Jonathan is somehow going to transcend and overcome the logic of how many thousands of years and generations of human nature and human history. And oh, for Jonathan's sake, what about for your own sake, David? You want to show him kindness for Jonathan's sake. Now there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba. And they called him to David, and the king said to him, now, are you Ziba? And he said, I am your servant. And the king said, is there not still someone of the house of Saul that I may show the kindness of God to him? Notice there's a, why do you want to know if there's an heir, a son of Jonathan left? Well, that I might show kindness to him for the sake of Jonathan. Now to Ziba, who had grown up in the house of Saul. If anyone is going to know, if news had gotten back to anyone about Mephibosheth and that he was still alive and somewhere out there, Ziba is the one who would know. He's the one with connections. That I might show him kindness, might show the kindness of God to him. Is this David? And what is it that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? That I might show him the kindness of David. Who are you? And what is working in you? And how do you know? Why are you speaking about the kindness of God? You're a man, a deeply flawed, broken man, just like everyone else. We know your history. We know of adultery and getting the husband of the woman you took and slept with and got pregnant, killed in a battle. That's part of David's biography. We know your failures and your weaknesses. And so what are you saying? You are equating the kindness that you show for Jonathan's sake with the kindness of God. It's quite a statement. I don't know what was going through Ziba's mind. You can only guess. My guess is Ziba is thinking, I do know. I do know that there's one left from the house of Jonathan. And I know where he is. And I'm afraid to, if I tell David and give him the information, this may cost the life of Mephibosheth. If I don't tell him and I say, nope, there's nobody. Nobody left? No, David, I'm all gone. I know nothing. No. Those messengers, no, that had nothing to do with them, nothing. No. Eventually, that lie will come to light. If at some time later he finds out that there is an heir, and that I lied and protected him, I lose my life and my faith. Now, I don't know, Ziba is another interesting, very human character when you read through the whole history, first and second century. Maybe he saw something in David, living now in David's house. Maybe the fact that he was still alive and retained by David, though he was a servant of Saul, was already worth the little tiny seed of trust. The little tiny seed planted inside that, despite everything common sense and human nature tells me, maybe, just maybe, when David said, I want to show kindness for Jonathan's sake, and I want to show the kindness of God to this one, maybe, despite everything my mind and my emotions are telling me, no one is that good. No one is ultimately going to put his self-interest aside. No one will risk his throne and his position when pressed and pushed hard enough. Oh, people are nice. People are kind. Until their own well-being and their own security and their own position and their own reputation is at stake. And then they will revert back to the same human nature that is in every one of us. Am I articulating something that anyone has ever thought in this room? But who is this David, and what is the work in him that is it even possible that this is true? That he's being real and honest, that this is the true nature and condition of his heart. Ziba said to the king, there is still a son of Jonathan. And interestingly, he makes a point of saying, there is still a son of Jonathan. He is crippled in his feet. Why that detail? Why is that the way Ziba, the one thing he has to say about his heir? He is crippled in his feet. The king said to him, where is he? And Ziba said to the king, he is in the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, at Lo-Debar. Lo-Debar that's just a transliteration from the Hebrew. Lo is the Hebrew negative, no or nothing. Lo-Debar means word or thing. In Hebrew, a word and a thing are the same. If you have the name and the word for something, it has substance. The word is the thing that it is a word of. I don't know if that comes through in Chinese. It's not always the case in English. So Lo-Debar is no thing. Or in a kind of modern American English idiom, Lo-Debar is nowheresville. He's out there it's nothing, nowhere, remote, cut off. This is way out in the countryside, cut off from everything, from all of modern life, from all of modern culture, as remote and distant and hidden as possible. And this has been his life. Crippled, the victim of forces beyond his control, and his whole sense of this, he lives in Lo-Debar. Have you ever been there? You don't have to go out wonderful place. Some remote little village nowhere, while the whole world seems to be going by, in Shanghai and Beijing and what, I won't embarrass myself by trying to name a whole bunch of other cities. There's a low de bar right in the middle of Beijing, in Shanghai, in Berkeley, in New York, in Paris. You don't have to be out of the woods to feel like you're living in nowheresville and you're not going anywhere. And life is passing you by. And there's nothing you can do about it because of all that's happened. Because you are crippled in your feet, in your emotions, in your mind. And you're just living day to day, waiting to die. Yes, there is an heir, and he's in Lodebar. The king sent and brought him from the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, at Lodebar. And whenever I read that, I have this picture of Mephibosheth out there in this little cabin, this little one-room cabin with a little wood stove that he cooks on, and life is just going by. And one day he looks up and he sees a cloud of dust on the horizon. And that cloud of dust gets nearer, and as it gets nearer, he begins to hear and feel the vibrations of horses' hoofs. And he says to himself, "This is the day. This is the day I have feared and dreaded my whole life. It's a troop of soldiers coming from Jerusalem, from David. He's found me, and now it's over." And they come, and they take him, and they bring him back to Jerusalem. What is going through his mind? What is his expectation? I can't bear the thought. David will probably wait. He won't let someone else do it. He will draw the sword. And I will have to see the look of satisfaction in the completion of his revenge, in the death of the last survivor, the last threat to his throne. I will have to see the blackness and the darkness of the heart of this man who, if it wasn't for David, who would I be and what would I be? And now he's brought in, because up to this point, he's only heard the stories. He's only heard the conclusions. He's only read the books by the sociologists and the philosophers and the critics of religion that are describing this ridiculous, superstitious, vengeful God of the Bible. He's only heard and been taught and grown up in school right from first grade and kindergarten on back in China, that there is no God, there's only matter and energy, we are the ones and the only ones who determine our own fate. If there's any healing and hope of getting over all this crippledness, it's in science and human wisdom. And if there were a God, he is a dark and evil character, because look at the suffering and look at the brokenness, and we've heard all about it. And now he has sent his messengers and brought you to him, and you're going to face this God who you've heard about and learned about and blamed for everything that's gone wrong in the world and in your life and your crippled feet for your whole life. And now you are standing before David, the real David. The king sent and brought him, and Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, son of Saul, interesting how he's described, son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David and fell on his feet and paid homage. Fell at his feet. fell on his face before David. A sign of utter defeat and humiliation, and the desperate hope for some kind of mercy and release in utter surrender, expecting surely the worst. And David said to this broken human being with a wasted life lying on his face in front of him on the ground, and David said, Mephibosheth. He's lying there face down in the dirt, and he hears David, from whom he expects only the worst. And what comes out of David's mouth is not a word of vengeance, not a word of gloating, not a word of judgment, but he speaks my name. He's calling me by name. And he answered, Behold, I am your servant. I am hopeless, helpless, and powerless, and utterly at your mercy. That's it. And David said to him, Do not fear. Do not fear. A lifetime of fear and resentment and anger. And the moment has come when he's lying there before David, and David says, Mephibosheth, do not fear. And those words, just those words, coming from the mouth of David. Not mere words, but he hears the voice of David. He feels the presence of David. And he believes those words because of who this man really is, all his faults and all his failings. Because this is a man after the heart of God. This is the real David speaking to Mephibosheth. Do not fear. For I will show you kindness. It's not for your sake. I will show you kindness for the sake of your father, Jonathan. You don't understand. But I made a covenant with your father. I made a sacred promise that I would preserve his house and his family, and I would not wipe it out from the earth. And when I make a promise, when I swear, when I enter into a covenant, nothing can break that covenant. Nothing. I will be faithful to my word. I have promised, and I will perform it. It's taken all these years. But Mephibosheth, it is for the sake of your father Jonathan. And I will restore to you all the land of Saul your father, and you shall eat at my table always. And he paid homage and said, What is your servant that you should show regard for a dead dog such as I? Now, what I would want to say here is, don't be so hard on yourself. Don't worry about a dead dog such as you. No, you're really. I think what David might have said is, you're right, Mephibosheth. You are a dead dog. As good as a dead dog. Completely given over to brokenness and bitterness blamed it all on what was outside of yourself, and you have nothing to commend yourself. There is nothing in you or about you that compels kindness and mercy. I will show you kindness and mercy because of your father, Jonathan. Because something happened before you were born, before you existed. I entered into a sacred covenant with your father. And for his sake, I will now, my affection for him is transferred to you simply because you are his son and I have promised something. Dead dog that you are, I will show you the kindness of God, because that's what God is like. Mephibosheth, while you were hiding, while you were out there in Lodabar, while you were fleeing from me and dreading the day that I would finally catch up to you and bring you to my plot and meet you face to face, all that while I was wanting to find you and longing to bring you back in order to show you kindness for Jonathan's sake. Your whole understanding of who I was, your whole expectation of what I had for you, your whole understanding of my character and my nature was totally, completely wrong, misshapen, and all the while you were, there's a verse in the Bible, it's in Romans chapter 5, where Paul said, while we were enemies, opponents of God, that is when Christ died for you. Not after, not because you decided to become a Christian, not because you changed your life, not because you somehow healed the brokenness of your soul. While you were embittered, while you were mocking, while you were rejecting, while you were saying there is no such thing, it's all matter and energy, and when you die you're dead, and if there was a God, I would want to overthrow his throne anyway, because he left things in the condition that they are, while you were his enemy and teaching and preaching against him, as I did in a university for years before I was a believer. That is when it turns out he was seeking me and desiring to show me kindness, because the Father in heaven had made a covenant with his Son to give his Son these people, these dead dogs, to transform and bring home, to eat at his table day after day and live in the palace. And I don't know every one of you. I'm sure some of you are and some of you aren't believers, and I don't know your backgrounds. They can't be much worse than mine. But I'm not trying to be funny or poetic or cute or insult you, but honestly, when I look around the room, I see what I see in the mirror. I see a bunch of dead dogs. And to whom God has chosen to show kindness for his Son's sake. Here's Mephibosheth. Not only will I spare your life, but I will bring you to live in the palace. I'll restore all the wealth that would have been yours, and you will come and eat at my table every day. And this is a big deal, and probably in more cultures than just the two represented here, but to sit down and eat together. I made a friend with, there's a meeting in Berkeley tomorrow, and so we're going to get together with some friends to other Jewish believers, New York expatriates. We all became Christians together back 41 years ago. And said, well, we've got to get to a meeting. I said, well, you've got to get to a meeting. I guess you'll want to eat an early dinner. I said, don't worry about it. Wherever Chinese people gather, there will be food. Don't worry about our eating. There will be food. There's something of it. Come, let's eat together. And this is the culture that I grew up in. Jewish mothers and Chinese mothers. Mom, I'm full. I can't eat anymore. Have another piece. Your skin and bones. He said, I just get 25. There's no flesh. There's nothing. I'm not hungry. Have another piece. And reaching across the table and eating together. It's like, that's what's reflected here. To come and to eat at the king's table is itself like a covenant. It's this most intimate bond. You invite me into your house and we break bread together. Or better than bread, we break jiaozi together. We're bound together. You brought me in to that place, the inner place, to sit at your table beside you with your family. We're family now. That's it. We're bound together. That's what David is saying to the grandson of the man who threw spears at him and hunted him like a wild animal and wanted to kill him. That's what he's saying to Mephibosheth. Something is going into Mephibosheth that is very healing. I want to skip down, and we're just about done. But honestly, this is my favorite line. This is the part of the story that has always undone me. Everything is restored. Mephibosheth is now in the palace where he would have been anyway, despite the hatred, despite all the evil that he had to say about David for his whole life, despite the vengefulness in his heart and the fear. He's sitting beside David at David's table. And I had this picture, and I've always had it, of it's dinner time. And all the king's sons and advisors and the privileged, wealthy, powerful men of Israel are all assembled in this great dining hall. And there's David at the table. And Mephibosheth comes and steps into the room. And he now has to walk across that room to sit beside David. Here's the last line of the episode. And it's the last we hear of Mephibosheth. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. And Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micha. And all who lived in Ziba's house became Mephibosheth's servants. So Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he ate always at the king's table. Now he was lame. Enters into the dining room, and in front of everyone, he walks across the room, limping on his lame and broken feet. So, well, let me tell you what was going to happen. Those of you in the room who you're not Christians and you're not believers, if you put your trust this Jesus of Nazareth, and if you believe the gospel, you will be healed of everything. You will be healthy, wealthy, and wise. You will become completely whole. Well, that's true. But not yet. I still limp. And I know most are looking. In some way, there's still the reality of living in a real world and bearing some scars and some brokenness. Mephibosheth finds the faith and the courage, the invitation of David waiting for him and calling him. And David doesn't see and say anything about the limp. No, there is no shame projected or put upon him. Mephibosheth, you are a dead dog. And the limp is still there. But nevertheless, limp or no, you are now like a son of the king. And you come and walk, I don't care if it's on broken feet. You come believing the promise and the covenant, and you come and sit beside me day after day. His feet may have still been broken and lame. His soul wasn't. His mind and his heart were now whole because of kindness shown to him for Jonathan's sake. And that is liberating. Knowing that it wasn't because of anything in me. I was the dead dog. But I can trust in this kindness and this faithfulness because it's grounded in something that took place before I was born. Therefore, it cannot be undone. Therefore, I can trust it and believe it. Because, David, if you were showing me kindness for my sake, how could I walk across that room? How could I sit beside you? Because I'm not going to be perfect. I'm not going to be absolutely whole. I'm not going to be without hope. I am in jeopardy of losing, if it's for my sake and because of me, then what happens when, whatever it is about me, what do you see in me that you should show me this mercy and bring me home? And what if whatever that is fails and I fall on my face again? What will that be? Where will I be then? But it is not because of anything in me. Therefore, it can't be taken away from me. Because this is your heart. You have just, David, you just revealed to me in your imperfection and humanity what the love and the covenant and the faithfulness of God is. It's for my name's sake. You are a dead dog and you are lame. And I delight to make you whole and bring you into the palace and have you sit and eat with me at my table for my own sake and for my son's sake. And therefore, you can trust this and know that it will never be withdrawn. Every day, Mephibosheth comes on those lame feet and mounts up to the table and sits beside and eats with the king. That's David. That is what it is to be a man after God's own heart. To have known that kindness and to show that kindness, to know what covenant loyalty is and a promise and faithfulness in the midst of all his failings. That's what God saw. And that's why God saw this man. And this is a man after my own heart. It is demonstrated more than anything, by this more than anything in anyone. It's reflected in his love for the grandson of the man who hated and hunted him. His love for the man with whose soul he was knit and one. I can no more break my covenant with Jonathan than I can disengage and disentangle my soul from him. My life is bound up with Jonathan. We are knit together. I love him as my own soul. And therefore, my covenant that I made with him, it is as unbroken as my love and relationship with him. And course, thank you for the Son of God. We see him in the New Testament. I'm tempted to say, I thank you more for David. And I don't think you're upset by my saying that. I thank you because this is a man whose imperfection and his own sin and his own brokenness is evident. And nevertheless, we can see you and your love in him. Thank you for revealing the love and the kindness of God in a real flesh and blood man who was not perfect in him. Thank you for David, and thank you for Mother Michelle. And I just pray that you would give all of us the light and the courage to see a dead dog in the mirror, and at the same time to believe and receive